our thoughts and come up with good answers as to the true meaning of your word. We know that sometimes we're a little confused and maybe we don't understand everything, but help us to fully divine the word of truth and be with us as we study tonight, and it's through Jesus that we pray. Amen. Okay, tonight we are going to look at the feeding of the 5,000, that miracle. Mickey started out last night with talking about how much that he learned in looking at the paralytic. And I think one of the things that comes out when we do a more focused study like this is that we go a little bit beyond. We take something like the miracle of the 5,000 and we read that as a unit. We don't go backwards and see what's going on, and we don't go forward. And sometimes if we look at what's going on in the world at that time, it brings a lot of different meanings to what we're going to be looking at. Mickey also said that he was not an Eric. Well, I'm not an Eric either. And I'm not a Mickey. But I am going to quote him a lot, because a lot of the things that he talked about last night really apply to all of the miracles, such as who benefits from them. Certainly we do. We're studying it tonight. We do benefit from what happened, from the study of the miracles. The people that were there, the crowd certainly saw it. And they do recognize in Jesus something unusual, something more than a mere man. And we're going to look at some of those thoughts that they had about Jesus as we conclude tonight. But I do want to emphasize a little bit as we go through this one, the apostles. They were such a key into what Jesus was doing. It was necessary that he equip them for what was to follow after his death. And that was going to be really a major issue. And we see that this miracle occurred during Passover. And it was the last Passover before his death. So he has about a year left to qualify or to prepare those disciples for what's to come. He pretty quickly, after this miracle of feeding the 5,000, goes on record for the first time to his apostles about his impending death. He does that 3 times during the last year. He will call his apostles together and tell them what's going to be in store when he goes to Jerusalem the last time. They have trouble understanding that. They have trouble getting their arms around that. And in fact, they really don't understand until after the resurrection, when they see him again. Then they began to put all of this together, all of the miracles, all of the teaching. That's when they are finally convinced that he is truly the Son of God. Feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle, really, that is present in all 4 Gospels. Is that important? I think that's one of those questions that I could argue really either side. It certainly brings our attention to it. It's significant in that each of those writers includes that. But on the other hand, once is enough. If we get it the first time. But I got interested in thinking about, is it important? My Bible has, at the beginning of the New Testament, it's called the harmony of the Gospels. Just how many things, how many events, how many scriptures are repeated in all of in the Gospels. There are 186 events that are included in that list that are mentioned in at least 2. There's only 17 that are listed in all 4. I found that pretty interesting. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, I'd encourage you to take a look at that. I have somewhere, if I can find it. Three of those are involved with John's ministry, from the beginning of the ministry through Jesus' baptism, and then when he leaves Galilee in Matthew 4, this miracle feeding the 5,000, when he enters Jerusalem, an account of Judas, the account in the upper room, in the garden, the grief in the garden, when he was deserted by the apostles, the torture that he went through, the denial, twice, both accounts when he was before Pilate are in all 4 Gospels, and then the last 3 are related to the cross. Well, it's really a small list. And of course, a lot of that is due to John being the outlier, that John focuses so much on the last days of Jesus and his ministry, whereas the other Gospels have far more in the early part of his life. It's just an interesting study. Okay. I'm going to take a look at Matthew's account first. Matthew is an outlier in one of the major parts of the feeding. Mark and Luke are very similar, and then John adds far more detail. And I'd like to go through Matthew's account first, and while we're doing this, we're going to be doing a lot of flipping back and forth between the other Gospels, but use Matthew as the initial focus and finish up with John. Okay. Matthew's account, feeding the 5,000, starts in chapter 14, verse 13. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. We need to understand what the "it" is. When Jesus heard it. The previous verse is talking about the death of John. His disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. So Jesus has heard about this account, or the death of John. And apparently that created a desire in him to go away. If we look back up at the very beginning of that chapter, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead." Herod has a thought in his mind that Jesus is John resurrected. He knows that he has killed John, that he has put his head on a platter for his daughter, ultimately his wife, but he knows that he's dead. So he is concerned. He has heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist." Now Luke adds another thought to that. Let's go over to Luke chapter 9. Verse 7. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, and he was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead, by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the old prophets had risen again. Herod said, "John I have beheaded, But who is this of whom I hear such things? So he sought to see him. How would John and his disciples, what would be their attitude if they believed that the man who had killed John was looking for him? Might be a little fear, might be a little consternation. Many believe that that is one of the reasons that Jesus elected to go to a deserted place. There's a lot of disagreement among commentators as to where that deserted place was. When we read this, and we'll look at some of them, most of them will say and believe that the place that they went to was east of the Jordan River. Went to a place called Bethsaida. If you look on your maps, Bethsaida will be most likely listed on the north end of the Sea of Galilee, just east of the Jordan. Can you think of any reason why Jesus would be wanting to go east of the Jordan if he was concerned about Herod? If you would, and I do hope we get some conversation going here tonight sometime, raise your hand and we'll get the microphone. Herod's authority did not go east of the Jordan. If you look on the maps, and he did have some authority east of the Jordan, but it was down near the Dead Sea, what we would call Edom. Did not extend east. Now, many commentators will say that that's why he chose to go over there. There are some who believe that the miracle occurred west of the Jordan. And I have some pictures. Could we get those up? Last week we had some friends in town, and I was talking about doing a lesson on this miracle, and Gary had just returned from over there and had some pictures that I think you might be interested in. Uh-oh. Yeah. Can we get the first one a little clearer? Well, we'll start here. That building in the background is called the Church of the Multiplication. It is on the traditional site of the miracle of feeding the 5,000. On that, can we go back to the previous slide? It was considered the site of this miracle as early, according to this, and this is a poster that's posted there, as early as 38. And I did a little looking about that. And very easily you can take this back to the 4th century as being identified. There was a church building at this location as early as the 4th century that was considered to be the place where Jesus performed this miracle. Yeah, okay, we got it where we can read it now. If you look at the 350 AD, there was a rock that was used as an altar, and it was at the center of the first church at this site, and it tells who built it. And that was built around 350. It was seen by some travelers and written down in the 4th century. So it goes way back and very well could be the actual location. Okay, let's go to the next one. That building in the back is the current church, and it was built in about 1932. It was built on the site of the first church, which was, again, built in 350. I was amazed at how green this area is. That's the Sea of Galilee in the background. This is on the northwest shore. Capernaum would be somewhere just over the building. And the opposite shore is where many people believe that the actual miracle took place. I was just impressed by how green everything was. It's called a desert in many places, but it's just a beautiful spot. And this is a high area that would be mentioned, that Jesus went to the mountain, to the high area. Okay, one last slide, one last photo. This mosaic is original. It dates from 350. And I was impressed by and when I saw that picture of the fish, I thought about the fish being the symbol of Christianity as early as the first century. Those fish are depicted in several Roman catacombs. They were used by Christians to identify other Christians, sort of a secret code. But the fish has been a symbol of Christianity for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, Justin. While we're in Mark, and I've already turned away from it, but I want to take a look here at some other things that Mark has to say that's a little bit different. In verse 10, in the apostles, remember in Matthew's account, we saw disciples, and here it's apostles. When they had returned, okay, when they had returned from what? Pardon? Luke 9. Where do you think the disciples would be returning from? Pardon? Well, no, the apostles now. Yeah, I said disciples, but disciples had come from bearing John. Where would the apostles had come from? Now, come on, you guys. Look at the very beginning of that chapter. And he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And he said to them, take nothing for the journey. We all know that story. He had sent the 12, he had sent the apostles out on their first journey by themselves. And they returned to him and told him all that they had done. Then he took them and went aside privately into a deserted place belonging to the city called Bethsaida. But when the multitudes knew it, they followed him, and he received them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God. So we have, differing accounts in several respects about this miracle. They each have something to add. They're not contradictory, they're additive. So we know that we have the disciples. It is possible that the apostles are the same ones that took John's body and buried it, but not very likely. So we have, in Matthew's account, disciples that were with Jesus, and we know that the apostles were with Jesus during this miracle. If we go to the account of John, when he's talking about it, he mentions specifically Philip and Andrew. And he calls Andrew the brother of Peter. Simon Peter. So we know that the apostles were there. And we know here that all 12 were there for that miracle. Okay, so we've got them all in place now. We're back to Matthew 14. Am I losing everybody tonight? I see some. We'll be a little more consistent now, maybe. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. You know, we know, and we talked about, Mickey talked about this last night, about the miracle of healing, how that was so important to those people. Here was a man that could heal their sick. He could heal their paralytics. They gathered and they wanted help, and he had compassion on them. When it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they might go into the villages and buy themselves food." Here's the first thing that we have about excuses or rationalizations about why they couldn't do it. The simple solution: let them fend for themselves, send them away. We ever do that? I see Steve back there, and I forgot to give him credit for those photos. He's the one that got those photos into the PowerPoint here. Thank you, Steve. Fend for yourselves. But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish." What's the excuse? Don't have the tools. Don't have what we need. We ever hear that? We ever say that? He said, "Bring them here to me." Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. 5,000 men. I don't know how many women and children. I don't know, would you double it? But were fed with 5 small, and we're going to say 5 small barley loaves and 2 fishes. Let's go to John's account now. John chapter 6. John's going to add some more details. And John's also going to continue, after we complete the reading of just going through the miracle itself, we're going to go through some of the reaction of the people. I think that's most interesting. Chapter 6, verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs, which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, this is where we see the timing, that this is literally beginning the last year of his ministry. a feast of the Jews was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. Some versions have shilling, and that's the two words that I found in the various versions, maybe others. But generally, about 200 days of labor. A shilling or a denarii was about 1 day's wage. Counting the cost, counting the money. Do we ever do that? Do we ever not do something because we can't afford it? We don't have the money. We don't know where it's coming from. Sure we do. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" This is the only count that we see who had those fish and the barley loaves. Small lad. Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." Now what would this miracle remind the people of in terms of him being a prophet? Why would they take this feeding of the 5,000 and consider him to be a prophet? Going silent on me? Okay, we've got one here.
Perhaps they were thinking about Moses, that fed the people when God fed Israel, and their minds probably was on Moses when God fed them manna.
I think you're exactly right. And when we get into the results, we'll see that come up where he rebukes them for thinking that Moses did that miracle rather than God. But they see in this miracle a correlation between feeding of the bread and the fish and the manna that God used to feed the people in the Exodus under Moses. Okay, one more here.
Well, during that time, did he promise that God promised that he would raise up somebody like Moses?
Deuteronomy
in the
18.
future, so they were, maybe that connection there.
Yeah. They had the promise, Deuteronomy 18, verse 15, I think. But anyway, yes, he had promised them a prophet. I think we certainly can see very easily how they would take the feeding, the miraculous feeding like this, and assume that he was a prophet like Moses. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now, what about this miracle would make some of them think that he was going to be the king, that he was a king or would be a king?
It's their basic need. He fulfilled their basic
Yeah, that is one of the basic needs that you have. What were they looking for? What were those people looking for? A king.
They were looking for a champion to overcome the Romans.
Okay, now we're getting there. Yeah. They had been without a king for centuries. The northern kingdom disappeared 750 years prior to this. The southern kingdom went into Babylonian captivity a little over 600 years prior to this. They had been without a leader of their own for over 600 years. They longed for, they wanted a leader, a king on the order of David to bring them back to the prominence that they had. Okay, we got a couple here. I knew we'd get wound up sooner or later.
Can't you see that they are getting back into the situation Israel was in when they had God leading them, and all of a sudden they wanted to be like the world and act for a king, you know? And you see these people getting to be like that. They're not giving God the credit per se. They are really wanting them a king, a human being, a man, instead of giving God the glory.
Giving him the credit, yeah, absolutely.
Your previous thought about prophet, about John 4:19, the woman who was being challenged by Jesus about 5 husbands that she had. And she says, I perceive that you're a prophet. Now, the people were looking for a champion, yes. And when they see this idea of a prophet appearing like this, it's something to reckon with.
It certainly is. It certainly is. And this may be a stretch too far, but back to Velma's comment, I think. He had proven that he could take 5 loaves and 2 fish and feed a Roman legion, 5,000 men. That is a big part of finding, equipping an army. That would be a natural thought. A big part of the logistics in raising an army to fight the Romans, and they despised the Romans. They despised Herod. Herod, an Edomite, being ruler over the Jewish people and flaunting all of the Jewish law. We know a lot of the things that he flaunted with his marriage. That's why John lost his head, was Herod flaunting marriage laws related to the Jews. So they're beginning to get a picture that here is a man, but there's something that's missing so far in this picture. He is not the Son of God. He is not God. He is a man. And this is what he's viewed as, a prophet or a king. Being recognized as the Son of God is going to come later. Okay, spend the last few minutes that we've got. I think next week, Tyler, do you have tomorrow's lesson? Is that going to be walking on the sea?
Yes, sir.
Okay, then we're going to skip that in John's reading. Skip down to verse 22. On the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there, and Tyler will explain this tomorrow, except that one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. However, other boats came from Tiberias near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came into Capernaum seeking Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, where do you come from?" Jesus answered them and said, "Most assuredly, I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled." And we talked about that last night, the physical versus the spiritual. They were here because their physical needs had been fulfilled. You ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. What they need is freely given. The spiritual side is freely given, and that's what they should be looking for. Then they said to him, "What shall we do that we may work the works of God?" Jesus answered and said to them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent." Therefore they said to him, "What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do?" "Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." And here's the verse where Jesus gets after him a little bit. Then Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly, I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven." He's making the analogy here that the bread, the manna, did not come from man, it came from God. That increase in food that they had just seen did not come from man, it came from God. For the bread of God is he who came down from heaven and gives bread to the world. This is the true bread. He is the true bread, the bread of life. Gives life to the world. Then they said to him, "Lord, give us this bread always." Jesus says to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I say to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe." They've seen him do all of these things, and they believe that he might be a prophet, he might be a king, but they don't go any further. "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that all he has given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me, and that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up in the last day." Okay, I've got one more, if I can find it here. Going back to Matthew for a minute. And this occurs a little bit later. Now, when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Then Jesus said, chapter 16, of Matthew, verse 5. Now when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Then Jesus said to them, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "It is because we have taken no bread." But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, "O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets you took up?" They had forgotten what had happened. They had forgotten that God could take care of their needs. Do we? We ever forget that? Okay, what's your takeaways from this? Okay.
All right. One of the things that I noticed in here is that he's got 2 groups of people. He has his disciples, and then he has the people that are sitting there. And if you notice, this is coming off of the apostles coming back from healing people and preaching and casting out demons and all this other stuff. And Jesus tests them and says, "What should we do?" And we just have this slave mentality. We get in this box and we can't think outside of it. And so same with the disciples. He asked them that question and they couldn't come up with a solution. Yeah. And then you have the people who he's speaking to, and they know their history and everything, but they still can't seem to grasp anything outside of what they can see and think beyond it. So, I mean, we all kind of had that caged mind when it comes to God and God working in our lives and God helping us out on a lot of things that we deal with from day in and day out, even reaching out to somebody or talking to somebody about Christ or whatever, because we sit in these boxes for so long and we just don't seem to be able to think outside it until somebody pushes us.
That's a good thought. They had just come from doing miracles, if I could say, on their own, but without Jesus being present. And yet they couldn't see beyond that immediate need. Okay.
My part is looking at what he said in John. He was talking about types and antitypes. He talked about the manna. Then he talked about, "I'm the true bread that came down from heaven." And so he explained it in a spiritual manner to let them know that even the manna that they ate was just a type of the true thing, Jesus Christ's bread coming down from heaven.
Yeah. And this will probably be a common theme in every miracle that we do, is that the spiritual versus the physical. The miracles are always dealing with the physical needs, and that's what people grasp. That's what we grasp. Take care of the physical needs first. And the teaching is take care of the spiritual needs first. And we can look at those people and say, why couldn't they believe? I mean, they saw it. Why don't they believe it? But we do the same thing. We do the same thing. While he's coming up, 2 things that we talked about last night: faith and trust. They didn't have that faith and trust that God could handle or Jesus could handle their needs. Okay.
You talked about a moment ago about the takeaway that we learn from this. There's a negative picture here too, that we need to have eyes that can really see and ears that can really hear. And they were so blind and so deaf that they could not see their nose despite their face. Are we like that too sometimes?
We are like that. with God's help, what can we not accomplish?
Nothing's impossible with God.
Nothing is impossible. Lack of funds, physical versus spiritual. Anything else? Well, I had some words of wisdom from my 15-year-old granddaughter. And I was kind of a little bit nervous about tonight, afraid I was going to run out of material, way too early. And she said, "Don't worry about it. When you run out of material, just send them to go get some cookies." So let's go get cookies.